Hi, this is Rhonda and Brian. We're back talking to you again about portfolio management. And in this video, we want to talk about the fourth principle in our approach to portfolio management, where we use a scientific method. We use a scientific method to look at approach, assumptions, and hypotheses when looking at getting the outcomes that we need to get. So we focus on outcomes, and you might remember from our previous videos, we focus on outcomes because we want to focus on efficiency, effectiveness. So again, agile transformations, they're typically focused on efficiency. We want to focus on outcomes being effective. So we have an outcome that we want to achieve. So where do we go from there? You have to come up with an approach to how you want to achieve that outcome. And that approach that you're going to take, you do your market research, you do your homework and come up with as much information as you can, but you're going to have to make some assumptions because you're not going to have complete information. And so you come up with some assumptions where you're basically going to assume certain things are true, even though you haven't proved them out and you don't have the data yet. But you have to make assumptions that certain things are true so that you can come up with your approach, and you're going to come up with a hypothesis based on that, on the actions that you'll take. The hypothesis will assume you'll get certain outcomes based on that approach you've come up with. And for those of you who might remember your 7th grade science course, basically what we're talking about here is the scientific approach, where we're looking at assumptions, hypotheses, and then we're going to generate data based on the actions and prove whether we've come up with the right hypothesis and assumptions or not. We want to prove this out. Brian, what do you think?
Yeah, the big point that you should know is that every time you come up with an estimate, any kind of numerical quantification, you're basing it off of assumptions. So your assumptions always exist. And oftentimes when I form my hypothesis, the hypothesis is actually defining a relationship between 3 things. First, the assumption that you started with. Second, the outputs that you're producing. Right? I'm assuming that I'm doing something and I'm going to produce these outputs, and I'm producing these outputs in order to create this outcome. So your hypothesis is going to describe the relationship between the assumptions, your outputs, and your outcome. And then after I actually create the hypothesis, again, using the scientific method, I need to test it. I need to verify that this hypothesis either is true and I can keep building my business off of it and achieve the outcomes, or disprove it so I can change my behavior. Now, when that happens, I'm going to collect some data. Now, keep in mind, when we define the outcomes, we talked about when you build your outcome-based breakdown structure, you're also going to define the characteristics or externally observable items that let you know that you've achieved it and try to quantify those. So that's going to give you some metrics you can look at. And we said you're also going to define some targets that you want to produce these outcomes by this date. And finally, we said you're going to produce some thresholds for analysis, right? And those thresholds for analysis will say, if I reach this numerical quantification, it means this. And if I reach this level, it means this. And so I'm going to use that data to determine, once I collect measurements, whether or not my hypothesis is true or whether it's false. And once I discover that, then I can take the appropriate corrective action to modify my approach as necessary to achieve the outcomes that I desire.
Right. And because we're working in a Scrum at Scale organization, this needs to be, and we have an outcome-based breakdown structure that spans the whole organization from strategy down to team, this is actually being done at every single outcome level of your outcome breakdown structure. And so, as we saw in our previous video, is that product owner loop who's responsible for making sure that the outcomes are achieved at their level of the breakdown structure. And so as that data is coming in and they're learning to either prove or disprove their assumptions and hypotheses, they're either keeping the direction, changing the direction, making modifications based on what they learn from that data as the teams are executing.
And it's really important that, we take that responsibility serious, because this is often a skill set that hasn't been well developed in our organizations. Once I actually receive the data, I need to look at the relationship and what the data tells me from the outcome perspective to see whether or not my hypothesis is true or false. But I also need to take some indications on the outputs to see if my underlying assumptions are true or false. So some further investigation needs to be done to figure out, do I need to change my assumption or do I change my hypothesis? Either way, I'm probably going to change my approach, but the more wrong I was in my underlying assumptions and my hypothesis, the more likely I'll have to do a pivot and completely change directions. Whereas if it's a small difference, just my hypothesis is wrong, then a lot of times just the mix as far as outputs to outcomes need to change on my delivery. So that is, again, very important skill to do that analysis.
Right. And in the bigger scheme of portfolio management, it's really important to understand at what levels are the outcomes being produced as anticipated, and at what levels, what layers we're at in that breakdown structure are the outcomes not being produced because the hypothesis or the assumptions are proving to be false. Because if we're finding at a certain layer the outcomes are not being produced, then all the outcomes, sub-outcomes underlying that may need to pivot also. And so there's a trickle effect down through the structure and an impact on that based on the learnings at that level of the structure itself.
Absolutely. So one thing we want to walk away with from this is that when you actually create your hierarchy, what you want to do is you want to expand it out, where I'm listing out, here are the outcomes, here are the assumptions that are tied to those outcomes, here's the hypothesis I have that I'm testing out, and then here are the outcomes that should be driven out based on that to actually achieve the outcomes. And so I need to have all these things linked up together so that I can actually see why I'm doing what I'm doing. And if one part is true, what are the other parts that need to change? And again, I'm going to do this at every level throughout my organization.
Right. And what this is showing me, again, is that product owner loop in Scrum at Scale. A big part of their role is doing this kind of analysis. And this is a little bit of a change from what a product owner role might traditionally be thought of. If that analysis isn't happening, then we might not get the decisions being made at the right time in the right place based on that data. And so that skill set that really needs to be taught is, how do you do this type of scientific method and do the analysis in order to make the decisions needed?
All right, well, we've discussed an awful lot. This is a huge paradigm shift for how we end up doing the portfolio management, and specifically the product owner roles and chief product owner roles. And so with that, we're going to sign off for now. And we'll be back next time to discuss another principle for portfolio management.